So, today we're going to be talking about Death Comes to Pemberley. Okay, it's not that dramatic, but we are going to be talking about Death Comes to Pemberley and is the book worth reading? So this is a review of both the book and the BBC miniseries, how they're different, and if you do love the miniseries, is reading the book worthwhile? I will give you my opinion on that in just a bit. So let me know in the comments below if you have read, seen, or have even heard of Death Comes to Pemberley. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about classic literature, history, and death at Pemberley. So, Death Comes to Pemberley was written by P.D. James, who is a very famous crime author. In 2011, it was published, and in 2013, it was made into a BBC's miniseries starring Anna Maxwell Martin and Matthew Rhys. I have long been a fan of the miniseries, but recently my friend died. Actually, no, she got married and moved to Canada, but when she did, she gave me this book. So I say I inherited it when she died and moved to Canada and got married to the love of her life. So I hope you're having fun in Canada, Kelsey. I miss you, but thanks for the book. Anyway, so let's just talk about the very basic storyline first, because it is the same in both the book and the movie. Overall, there's obviously differences, but the basic plot line is that it is a sequel to Pride and Prejudice, and it's 6 years into the marriage of Darcy and Elizabeth. They're living in Mr. Darcy's glorious house at Pemberley, and they're about to have a ball called Lady Anne's Ball. It's named after Mr. Darcy's mother, Lady Anne. Anyway, Elizabeth is busy making preparations when all of a sudden Lydia shows up, who was not invited because, again, remember, Lydia's married to Wickham and Wickham's creepy. Anyway, Lydia shows up, but she's screaming that there's been murder. And so it turns out that Lydia was going to come crash the ball, and she was in a coach with Wickham and Denny, who, if you're also a big P&P fan, you know Denny is another soldier from Pride and Prejudice. And they're coming up the road through the Pemberley woods when Denny gets out, runs into the woods, and then ends up dead. And Wickham is the #1 suspect. But did Wickham kill Denny? What's going on? And it goes into this sort of crime investigation, and we see the court trial and all of that greatness. While of course a lot of the characters from the original are in it, Bingley and Jane are in the book. Just Jane shows up in the miniseries for some reason. Of course, you have Georgiana, who has a love triangle going on. Always love those. And of course, Lydia and Wickham and Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. So up next, here's a quick review of the book. So overall, the good of the book, I feel like it's very cozy in an Austen way. It's like the cozy little Austen world. And I also love that she treats the Austen world like it contains all of Austen's novels. So there are references to characters both from Persuasion and Emma in the book. Now, you could actually sort of miss that almost in the miniseries. There's just one very quick reference to a character from Emma in the miniseries, but it's much more obvious in the book. With P.D. James being this very famous crime writer, she served a lot, of course, in the British government. I feel like she definitely did a lot of research into how trials and investigations worked back then, and you definitely see that in the book. Like, she's going to lengths to make it accurate. But then at the same time, there's a lot of like tongue-in-cheek references or things said that are like, well, wouldn't it be great if this thing happened instead? And of course, it's what's going to happen in the future. Or, oh, that's not possible, but it's something that's going to happen in the future. So it's very aware of itself as historical fiction, which I think too, on the maybe, I don't know if it's bad, but it's just a fact, is it's obviously historical fiction. Historical fiction versus true classics has some telltale signs as soon as it starts happening, which is where they describe in detail something that an author of that time period would assume everyone knew, and they wouldn't describe in detail. It would be like us talking about opening a refrigerator, what the inside of the refrigerator look like, this and that. Where in a real book written now, you'd just be like, oh, they grabbed something from the fridge. because everyone knows what a fridge is and what the inside of it looks like. So in historical fiction, authors do this, and she definitely did that, where she would describe in detail something that Austen would have taken for granted that her audience knew. And so on some of the aspects that were maybe not the best parts of the book, I feel like P.D. James wanted to have a lot of commentary on the first book. She had a lot of flashbacks where she would have the characters almost reanalyze what happened in Pride and Prejudice, the original, Or she had this huge conversation between Darcy and Elizabeth where he analyzes all his past actions. And I think a lot of it was just her trying to reinterpret the first book in her own fashion, which didn't really move the plot line along, and I didn't think made the book stronger. She also would take a lot of quotes, which at the beginning of the book was okay. Like, there's a few like rehashing of famous quotes from the original Pride and Prejudice, and I'm like, okay, it's just trying to set the scene a little bit, but it just kept happening to the point that it would take me out of the story. I was like, okay, like, I don't think the characters and the narrator would be constantly saying the same thing over and over again just because it was in the first book. And of course, she made alterations to characters' overall personalities, such as Colonel Fitzwilliam. I think too, just on the level of writing itself, she did this thing several times where she would repeat not really essential information, almost word for word. It was like random details, and it would be repeated 3 times within 50 pages, and it was like, okay, we get it. Elizabeth was like, we don't need these flowers. And then like a few chapters later, Elizabeth was again like, oh yeah, we don't need these flowers. 5 pages later, Elizabeth had decided they didn't need the flowers, and it wasn't even relevant to the plot line. It was just like, why are you repeating the same thing over and over again? And then finally, I think on plotting, things were underdeveloped. Things she should have really went into were passing mentions, and too much of the story was saved for the end and then brought out in conversation. It was like, okay, here's the bulk of the book where you get a few hints of what happened, and at the very end it's like, boom, let's just have long conversations about what's happened, not really emotionally react to any of it, and then move on with our lives. Okay, so now let's talk about the miniseries. I feel like ultimately what happened with the miniseries is the writers came in and they took stuff that had overall good bones, like maybe it was like a good first draft, and they made it so much better. I have to say, this is one of those times where the movie or the miniseries is so much better than the book. First of all, I just have to give a shout out to Pemberley, which is, of course, my ultimate favorite place on the planet, which is played by Chatsworth House. And if you haven't seen my video, my trip to Chatsworth House / Pemberley, then definitely check that out, because I'll tell you all about my trip to Pemberley there, obviously. But overall, I feel like what they did is they found those aspects of the book that could have been really interesting if she had delved deeper into them, like Mr. Darcy's feelings about his marriage, the issues with the Bidwell baby, the whole love triangle with Georgiana. The love triangle ended in like chapter 2. It felt like, oh, we have a love triangle for 1 second in the book and then now it's done. Where they actually really developed it into a full issue in the miniseries. And I feel like that was the thing. It's like everything that was barely glazed over in the book was finally fully developed. Also, everything was more dramatically told. Everything was like way more dramatic and more emotionally intense, and also tightened. Obviously, the timeline was tightened, and the investigation was tightened, and also you felt like, at least I felt like, you got to see the story play out more believably, where all of the information is told throughout the plot versus not much happening and then all of it's coming out at the end. Also, I feel like in the miniseries, they bring in Lydia Bennet and Mrs. Bennet into greater comic effect, and also Elizabeth becomes more central to the story. So in the book, Mr. Darcy, I feel like, takes over a lot of the story, probably because at this time in history, a man would be more involved in the investigation than the woman was. But in the miniseries, Elizabeth definitely comes to the forefront. She has this more active voice and a bigger impact on how the whole story plays out, and I feel like. I think a few things that happened in the miniseries that might not be the best is that they did simplify the investigation, they simplified the trial, so I feel like a lot of maybe historical accuracy was thrown out in order to do that for the series. And of course, we don't get as full of backstory on characters like Mr. Alveston, which is one of the guys in the Georgiana love triangle and that sort of thing. And also, I want to point out that the ending is different. I mean, it's not hugely different in that, like, the outcome of the investigation and trial is not different, but a lot of the things that happen to secondary characters and how it happens is significantly different. So I just want to throw that out there. I do love the miniseries ending, but there's a couple things, especially when it's referencing other characters from Jane Austen's world, that I thought was kind of cute in the book. So overall, I definitely would recommend watching the miniseries from the BBC. It's absolutely amazing. Obviously, is it fully capturing Jane Austen's characters? No, but this is what I have to say on that. First of all, honestly, I don't like the majority of sequels or spin-offs of Jane Austen's works. Most of them are awful, just terrible. This one is actually on the good side of that. And I think part of it is a lot of them lack depth. And another thing is Jane Austen's characters were real in her head. Like, they were very real to her. She understood them. And so anyone else trying to take Jane Austen's characters, they can't do it. They're not the people in Jane Austen's head. They're now the people through a filter in this new person's head. So they're never going to fully capture what Jane Austen wrote in any sort of spin-off or sequel. But I feel like for what it is, it did it well, right? You have to sort of like accept that it's not going to be the same, and that's okay. But I did really enjoy it. Anyway, so that is my review of should you read Death Comes to Pemberley, and ultimately only if you want to, because honestly, the miniseries is better. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe and have an awesome day. Bye! There's a UPS guy. Whenever I sit here and do videos, just the delivery people just fall out of the sky.